This is Terry Graham reporting for the Real News Network here in Baltimore City, Maryland. We're outside Courthouse East, where defense attorneys just wrapped up their closing arguments in the Cesar Goodson trial, one of 6 officers charged with the in-custody death of Freddie Gray. I'm here with reporter Stephen Janis, who will give us an update. What happened in the closing arguments today?
Well, you had both sides, obviously the defense and the prosecutors, giving their final statements. But it was very interesting because I think a lot of what you see is stuff that hasn't been reported. Jan Bledsoe, who was prosecuting the case for the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, went into a very detailed argument about all the times that the officers got out of the van and looked at Freddie Gray. It was kind of interesting because I think for a lot of us who have watched this case, you haven't seen it brought out in such detail. And there were really 6, although there have been 5 reported stops, there were actually 6. And in each of those stops, there are different scenarios where the officers got out of the van to check or to look on Freddie Gray.
Yes.
None of which, you point out, did they ever call for medical attention, including one, the 5th stop, where Officer Goodson is seen waving his hand, pointing back to the van. Not Officer Goodson, but Officer Porter. Mm-hmm. So Officer Porter, who is the first officer who was tried, is seen in the picture raising his hand, pointing towards the back of the van. He goes to the back of his van with Officer Goodson, and again they close the doors. And another time where Officer Goodson, who is the person on trial, made a stop that was not called in, that was not reported, and goes again and checks on the van. And one of the reasons this is important from a legal perspective is that one of the arguments the defense make, getting to the defense, is that Officer Goodson had no obligation to make any calls about Freddie Gray's safety or his health condition because Freddie Gray was uncooperative, because Freddie Gray was combative. So he's saying the whole time, the defense is making the argument, he didn't have to do anything because he was concerned for his safety, and if Freddie Gray is combative, he has no obligation, which I don't know if that's true. But the thing is that if Freddie Gray was this combative prisoner, why didn't they call it in, which Jan Bledsoe points out? Why did he keep going to the back of the van and looking in the van and then closing the door and getting back and driving? And she made a very interesting point when Officer Goodson calls in at one point, one of the stops, you can hear Freddie Gray moaning.
Yes.
But you can't hear him screaming or banging his head. And another interesting thing about the combative prisoner, which I think is part of the key to this case, is that Jan Bledsoe made the point that there was no blood or lacerations on his head of any kind, that a person who was sitting in the back of a metal van, banging his head against a van, I think would obviously, cause some sort of injury.
Isn't the defense actually offering the alternative that Freddie Gray injured himself in the back of the van, that he is alone responsible for the injuries that he received, and that Officer Goodson isn't a neurologist and therefore couldn't have seen those injuries?
Great point. There was a very dramatic point during the defense closing where he said, for whatever reason, Freddie Gray, instead of staying prone on the ground, decided to get himself up and cause the injury. And yes, he said, these officers are not trained to identify neurological disorders. Their strongest statement was that Freddie Gray was injured after the 5th stop.
Yes,
so there's
between
no
the
way,
5th and 6th stops.
There's no way they could have known or to get any sort of medical attention to him because he wasn't really seriously injured until he got to the last stop. But really, really interesting point. At the last stop, Officer Goodson doesn't call in any help. Officer Goodson doesn't open up the back of the van. Mm-hmm. Officer Goodson doesn't do anything. He simply leaves it. It was another officer who ends up calling, and I don't remember his name. Mm-hmm. But it's really fascinating that he would stop the van 5 or 6 times, get back to the district, and then leave the van and not make a single call.
And wasn't there also an unreported stop? Didn't Officer Goodson stop and not report it?
Yes.
And isn't that absolutely part of the general orders that you're supposed to report every time you stop your van?
That was a point that Jan Bledsoe made, was that the van stopped. It was an uncall. He didn't call in. It was right before he turned onto Fremont, where they say he kind of sped up. He didn't call it in. He didn't say, and she said that's dangerous not to have officer assistance. He went to the back of the van, opened up the back of the van and looked in, closed the van, and then drove on. Yes, and that was the stop that was just before he took sort of the wide turn and onto Fremont and sort of went into the other lane, crossed over to the oncoming traffic lane, and, is part of the rough ride theory.
Now, this is a crucial case, and doesn't the defense basically hinge on them being able to show that the prosecution doesn't have any sort of real evidence that they're offering?
I think this case is critical because it's the most serious case. He's charged with depraved heart murder, which is the most serious charge. He is the person who would seem to be directly the most culpable because he was the person driving the van. And it hinges on a couple legal theories that could have bearing on other cases, which is specifically how responsible is an officer in this case for the well-being of the passenger or the well-being of the detainee, as they were saying. If legally he's deemed to be completely not responsible for the safety, then who is responsible? And what does the law really say? And I think that's something that, might have to be addressed maybe in the legislative session or at some point, because it really seems to me that if Officer Goodson's not responsible, then who is? Okay, we're here with Stephen Tabling, a former lieutenant in the police department, also a person who investigated police-involved shootings. So there's a lot of experience. And Steve, I want to ask you a few questions about the case. One of the arguments made today by the defense is that if a prisoner is at all combative, then the person who's transporting him or the officer responsible has no responsibility for his safety throughout the continuum of that custody. Is that something that you think sort of jives with your experience?
Well, I have to go way back because we never had this problem. We used to ride in the back with prisoners. And, to say who's responsible for his safety, I don't know what their procedures in the department are now. They have general orders, and I have no knowledge of what they might be.
Well, let me just get to that. So you would ride in the back with the prisoners. Were they restrained, or were they in seatbelts, or how would it work?
They weren't restrained. We had a wooden seat that the prisoners sat on. Most of them were handcuffed, and we had a little seat by the back doors with a handle to hold on to. And from the time we picked them up until we took them in to be booked, we were sitting in the back with them.
So wasn't that considered dangerous for you, or why? How did you do that?
Well, I guess it was some danger, but we really never had any problems. We never had any kind of problems. If somebody was injured or something, we just took them right to the hospital.
Well, now I want to ask you a question. I guess that means that kind of precluded doing rough rides, because you had police sitting in the back. Did you do rough rides?
No, we never did any rough ride. You got to remember, when you're sitting like in a 3/4-ton panel truck and you go through some of these seats, you're going to get bumped around. There's no doubt about that. But far as trying to say rough rides, I worked the cruising patrol for over a year, and I was never involved in any rough rides.
Let me ask you another question, because some of the things they say about they don't want to get in the van and seatbelt them because they're afraid he's going to take their gun. You were actually in the back of the van with everybody.
That's right.
How were you able to do that if weren't you afraid they would take your gun?
When we put them in a wagon, they were always handcuffed, and we sit them on this seat on the side. They were handcuffed, and I was never afraid of my weapon with handcuffed people in there, and I always had my weapon in a position where nobody could get to it.
We are here with Todd Oppenheim, who is a public defender, also a candidate for judge still. So we wanted to talk to you. There was one thing that was very interesting in the defense, or in the closing arguments, that the defense said that Officer Goodson has no responsibility for Freddie Gray's safety if Freddie Gray was perceived to be combative. What do you think about that argument?
It's a difficult argument to make. I think that he does clearly bear some responsibility. I mean, that is their duty. They care in custody of detainees. But, obviously as a defense attorney, you have to turn it around and say, well, wait a minute, his duties were being obstructed by the person he's trying to take into custody, almost that he can't carry out his duties. It's difficult because, representing indigent people, mainly black people in the city, I see how people are treated when they're taken into custody by the police, and a lot of the times things will be misconstrued or written up in a different way than reality. And the police may write it up as the person being combative when in reality it's the police being aggressive versus them.
I want to ask you a question, because what struck me during the entire sort of argument that Jan Bledsoe made was that they kept stopping the van and looking in the van. And what exactly were they looking at? I mean, what do you think? Just you sat through the whole thing. I'm putting you in a tough position, but to me as a lawyer, if you're a defense lawyer or a prosecutor, what are you thinking? Like, why do they keep looking in the back of the van?
Well, it becomes questionable at that point. That's the question in the back of everybody's mind. Does that imply that they knew something happened to him or not? But, the ultimate question and the difficulty of this trial is, can you take an inference like that and then convict someone on that? Right. When there isn't clear evidence of his intent to go and look in the van. I mean, it certainly doesn't pretend well. It shows a guilty conscience to do that, but is that enough to convict someone on?
Right.
And then do we want that standard, that same application of justice being applied to the everyday defendant?
Right.
Before adjourning today, Judge Barry Williams announced he will render a verdict Thursday morning. This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network from Baltimore City, Maryland.